is question time now, social services style. So if you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a roving microphone to you.
My name is Tessa. I work at Tandem, the Victorian peak body representing families, carers and supporters in mental health. And I do want to thank you for your efforts with this year's budget to support families in what is a really difficult economic year. I'm hoping to be cheeky and ask two questions from my policy colleagues. One is that around the calls that we've been getting from our members who are worried about if and when they will be getting a mental health and wellbeing local in their community. And I'm wondering how that information and information around how other timelines in the mental health reform agenda have been impacted are going to be communicated so that we can communicate them with our members.
Sure. Thanks very much for the questions. Was there two there?
I've got a second one.
Oh, okay, right. Well, I'll deal with number one first. You can mark me on my performance and then you may or may not wish to ask me the second one. So, look, mental health is an enormous journey that this community is going on, and as a government I think we need to recognise that there is not going to be a simple and an immediate solution to the problem, but the one thing I can assure you is that this government takes our responsibilities in this space very seriously. So we put $7.9 billion since 2015 in rebuilding the mental health system from the ground up. We've also said that it would be a long journey. We never pretended that we're going to get there with one budget or one set of initiatives. We are investing in the workforce and we do have very clear workforce limitations. We've put $15 million into trained staff for the mental health locals, and we're going to have more to say on when the 50 to 60 outlined in the Royal Commission will be delivered as we get more certainty over workforce pipeline, and I don't think there's much doubt that we've struggled in terms of being able to access sufficient people to be able to give us the resourcing to deliver these services. We won't be lowering the mental health levy, as there's been some suggestion. Every cent is going to be spent on mental health, and funding will, of course, increase in 24-25. So certainly our perspective is we've had, with the mental health locals, we've had rollout challenges, and I think anybody in this sector knows exactly what I'm talking about because you've lived at large yourself in terms of being able to secure staff. It was one of the reasons we've tried to move away from the lack of certainty about funding for this sector so that at least you could tell a story to potential employees and those who want to stay in employment, that you had the certainty of funding and indexation mechanisms going forward. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. But it also segues pretty well into my second question, and this one is from our policy team, so it is a little bit longer. They've asked, an expansion of the lived and living experience workforce is a cornerstone of the Royal Commission's vision and integral to the success of the reforms. Positive that the budget contains funding to grow the locals' workforce. We would like to ask if a proportion of that has been earmarked for lived and living experience roles and how the government's commitment to expand this workforce will be met throughout the reforms more broadly.
Well, there's a lot in that, and I've got to tell you, I have limitations in terms of the knowledge that I have about this area. I think when it comes to the Lived Experience Agency, which I think was recommendation number 29 from the Royal Commission, our work is aimed at rebuilding that mental health system from the ground up, and it is moving at pace, but as I would appreciate, you'd like to see us move quicker. We've got work underway on more than 90% of the Royal Commission's recommendations, and that investment of $6 billion is already delivering better mental health care right across the state. Just extensive work on lived experience within the system has been undertaken. Ongoing investment of $10.36 million has been provided per year for lived and living experience workforce redevelopment. A lived experience branch has been developed in the mental health and wellbeing division within the Department of Health, and massive funding increases for the state's mental health consumer and carer peak bodies. However, I think some recommendations that we've implemented will be implemented later than initially proposed, and I think we've got to be frank about that. And the reason for it is really essentially about workforce capability and our ability to sequence the recommendations for the next phase of reform. Nevertheless, we remain committed to implementing all 74 of the Royal Commission's recommendations, and there is an enormous investment going on here, but it is somewhat constrained. Our hope is that we will be able to get those programs up and active as soon as practically possible.
All right, where are we going next?
Treasurer, it's Bevan Warner from Launch Housing up the back here, and I just wanted to thank you for your commitment to the early intervention investment framework and for calling out the intergenerational inequity of wealth transfer going in the wrong direction from young people to older people. That is a big problem, and I was just wondering in that context what you're hoping for from the Commonwealth budget on Tuesday.
Well, look, I suppose I don't want to be one of those people who creates a problem for somebody else to fix. So I accept that as a government we've got a responsibility to work with the federal government around coming up with solutions. There's no doubt that the tax system and the way that we're taxing people is having a profound effect. And what are the solutions to that? I don't know. I'm sure many would tell me that the burden of stamp duty is one of the contributors to the limitations on young people moving into housing. So I don't come to this debate entirely pure, but you know, we have to think practically about what the solutions might be in order to give young people greater access to housing. That's why we put in place the shared equity scheme. It was about basically making it a heck of a lot easier for people to get to a point where they could service loans and get bank approvals for loans. What am I looking from the federal government? Well, honestly, partnerships. I think every time I come into a forum like this, I spend a lot of time, bemoaning the fact that we're not getting our fair share. I got some poor person in Treasury recently to sit down and go back on our GST share per capita back to 1950. That's one of the things you can do when you're Treasurer, get other people to do the hard work. So the really interesting thing about it is it showed that Victoria and New South Wales consistently all the way through that period on a per capita basis have subsidised the rest of the nation. Victoria slightly more so than New South Wales, but not massively so. But Victoria's paying today, that collective per capita effort comes to just short of $18,000 for every man, woman and child in this state. So when you read the papers that the Victorian economy is not performing well, firstly that's nonsense, and generally written by somebody who doesn't understand the difference between a budget and an economy. But believe me, there are differences. The most substantive one being my budget is only 1/7 of the Victorian economy. The other critically worrying thing, I think, is in those partnerships with the Commonwealth, we've got to stop the games of cost shifting back and forward between tiers of government. One, it makes for a cynical population, but two, it creates a lot of inertia in terms of a dynamic and reformist government, because everybody's trying to hide behind the other tier of government's responsibility. So getting those national partnerships worked out, I would like the Commonwealth to stop spending so much time and money checking the homework of the states. Quite frankly, we don't sit around trying to work out how we can rip the Commonwealth off. We spend a lot of time trying to think how we can improve the quality of service and get better bang for the dollars that they provide for us. So, you know, it's one of the great irritations of my time in public life that you look at the 6,000 or so public servants employed in the education system in Canberra. I don't know what they do. They certainly don't run an education system. But they're clearly checking up on what we're doing. And I'm not advocating that you get rid of every public servant, maybe a few of them, but what I am saying is, wouldn't it be better if we could agree that we respect each other and treat each other with a degree of, well, I don't know, maturity? I wrote to Jim Chalmers about a year and a half ago now, and I talked to him about the early intervention investment framework, and I said, you've got to get onto this. You've got to pick it up in the way that your policy framework works, and you've got to think about working with the states to recognise that you are the principal beneficiary of the early intervention investment framework. Think about it in this context. Young people avoiding the juvenile justice process don't spend a life of recidivism in and out of incarceration, but they become productive members of society. Who benefits from that? Well, society, obviously, the young people, obviously, but the federal government as a tax taker, income tax taker in particular. They get a very big benefit out of it. It'd be great if I had a partner with them in being able to drive that sort of reform.
Just before we go on to the next question, I just wanted to interject, Treasurer, if I could. If I was a journalist asking that question, I'd want to know, do you have a shopping list for the budget when it comes out, the federal budget, in that space of closing that gap, which I know is an important subject for you, for closing the gap between the younger and older generation? Surely you're closing your eyes at night going, please announce this to help that. What is it?
Honestly, this is probably not the answer you're looking for, but no, I don't have a shopping list. I know each and every one of our ministers are constantly talking to their federal counterparts about what they'd like to see delivered in their respective portfolio areas. We've got a couple of very, very big agreements coming up in the not too distant future. The NDIS, the National Hospitals and Health Reform Agreement, and of course the National Schools Agreement coming up. They will account for billions and billions of dollars, not just of Commonwealth money, but of state money. And my view, my hope, is that we can move dramatically away from this idea that the Commonwealth basically tells the states what they'll do and expects the states, who are, at the end of the day, the people who understand how most of these systems work. The Commonwealth are the tax getter. They are not the service delivery provider, but they're a big tax getter. 81 cents in every dollar of tax that you pay to the Commonwealth government. But it seems to me that therefore we need a mature, a responsible and engaged arrangement with them. No, I'm not setting a log of claims to Canberra saying, I demand you do this. They're pretty well aware of the things that we as a state would like through each of those portfolio areas. And we'll see exactly how it stacks up on budget night. But I'd prefer to see this rather than a watershed moment of the quality of the budget that the Federal Treasurer brings down, a watershed moment in terms of the relationship. I don't want to dissect the budget and say, well, this was good and this was bad. I'm sure there'll be plenty of prognosticators who'll have that view. What I'd prefer to be able to say is there has been a weather shift in terms of the maturity of the relationship, and we're working together.
Is anyone sensing a bit of friction between the state and federal governments here, or is that just...
That's just you.
It's just me. Up the back there.
Hello, my name's Raymond. I'm here with the MCM, Melbourne City Mission. I've been homeless as a kid and as a young adult. What would you say to a young person sleeping rough and needing a safe place to sleep tonight?
Thanks very much, Raymond, for your question. And look, the sort of experience that you've gone through and the experience that so many others confront is very real, and it's quite frankly an indictment of any caring society that we haven't been able to come to a solution that actually adequately meets the community's needs. And I'll tell you, during the course of the November 2020 budget and the May 2021 budget, I had a lot of discussions with our then Housing Minister and Minister for Homelessness, Richard Wynne. It went something like this: let's not start this discussion about how much this costs. How do we break the back of homelessness? We know that there are jurisdictions around the world that do this incredibly well, and Finland is probably the best location, certainly the one that most homelessness advocates say we should be looking at. So, of course, they have homes for the homeless, and it's a very big and generous strategy. We thought that we were getting on top of it back then at the height of the pandemic, putting everybody we could find and everybody who was willing to go into supported accommodation into a location during the height of the lockdown, because we knew that was the best way of keeping them safe. Something like $500 million was spent in that budget and the following budget on homelessness. And as a government, we continue, of course, to make contributions and investments in homelessness in this budget. The number has escaped me. I think it's in the vicinity of about $200 million. But the broader question really is not the size of the dollars that we're contributing to homelessness, but the level of focus and continuing commitment to deal with it. There's no doubt that you can't simply say, well, we'll get you into accommodation, job done. We know that there are so many people who are in a homeless situation, who are escaping domestic violence, or who have alcohol and other drug addiction issues, or mental health issues that they need support with. So it's not a simple solution, but it's one that as a government we remain committed to. So what I would say to that young person is reach out. In this room there are community service organisations that can assist. Be assured that the state government is committed to redressing this issue, and to the extent that we come up short, can I tell you it's not from a lack of trying.
You happy with that?
Hello, Treasurer. I'm over here to your left, and I am standing up, so just checking that you've got me. I'm Chris Matheson. I'm the CEO of Free. We're a specialist family violence organisation operating in Melbourne's east, and we go quite deep out, sort of past Warburton in the east. Maybe some reflections against a couple of things that you've said rather than a question as such, but firstly to start by thanking the Labor government over the past few years around the investment through Royal Commission, the reform environment, and just the injection of funding and policy thinking into the sector, so that's deeply appreciated. We're now landing as a sector in a different phase of, working through post that high level of investment. A couple of things you mentioned around the early intervention investment framework, which you've touched on in your question responses, but also the gender responsive budgeting, which is, really welcome, and changing a person's life trajectory. There's just three things I'd be interested in your reflections. One is, and picking up on the previous question from a young person experiencing homelessness, is on any given night we have 25 to 30 women and their children in motels across the eastern region who have already experienced family violence and are fleeing during the night often with their children. So the link to housing, homelessness and family violence is obviously, there's a lot of evidence there, so there's just a comment around that. The other one is prevention, and picking up on your early intervention comments around the framework. And we applaud the government's commitment to contribution to our watch, which is around, primary prevention and Respect Victoria. But for an organisation at the grassroots level like us, we contribute $600,000 per annum, training people in gender equity, education programs, etc., and get $0 from the state in that grassroots local primary prevention and education. And finally, because I'm sitting at the table with Tanya and our peak body, Safe and Equal, just moving towards outside of the funding and service agreement window to ongoing commitment to funding that is not that cyclical, having to go through that process. So just some reflections before you get to your hair appointment. Thank you.
Yeah, that was 30 years ago, the last one I had. Just on the issue of family violence, and can I say we recognise that this is becoming topical, can I put it that way, and not pejoratively in any way. It's topical, but it's not something that's just occurred to your organisations, or might I say to this government. It's something that we've known has been a very dramatic problem, and one that as a community we've failed effectively to come up with the solutions that keep women and children safe. The government, of course, has implemented all 227 of the Royal Commission into Domestic Violence recommendations, and that's $3.8 billion of effort that we've put in place to try and respond to the problems that women most notably, of course, confront in a family or domestic violence situation. The budget also puts in this budget $269 million to prevent family violence and to support women's safety. So we recognise that the work doesn't finish simply because we've had a Royal Commission. We've looked into the issue, and the truth is we're still losing far too many women, particularly to intimate partners across this country. So recognising that, I think I would simply say that as a government we are going to continue the effort. In fact, the Premier has made it clear that she'll have more to say in coming weeks on a women's safety package, because violence against women and girls, quite frankly, in this society, given the journey that we've been on, it is nothing short of a travesty, indeed a tragedy. So we've seen all too clearly this year, with one woman being killed by an intimate or former intimate partner every 4 days. Quite frankly, it's a disgrace in this country that this sort of behaviour is happening. And as I mentioned in the Parliament, when I was a bit angry with the behaviour that certain members of the opposition were treating out to certain members of the female leadership of our government, I said bad outcomes for women start with bad attitudes by men to women. And ultimately, I think we have to all take responsibility for our behaviour, and governments have to take responsibility for what more we can do in the educational space. So firstly, I apologise for any shortcoming in funding, but secondly, I recognise that we are going to have to do a lot more in that programmatic and educative space in order to make sure that we get to men, basically, to change men's attitude. I think I dealt with most of... you thanked us for the early intervention framework, and basically, look, I'm very excited about it. I genuinely am. This is something that has changed the way that Treasury thinks. And believe me, to get Treasury to start to think creatively about investing in things early in the expectation that maybe we'll avoid more substantial acute costs further down the track, that's been a journey of realisation for Treasury officials, and I want to pay tribute to them. They have been nothing short of imaginative, inventive, and I think they've got themselves an amazing passion for this area of policy intervention too, which is quite inspirational.
Just got a question over here, Treasurer.
Hi, Treasurer. I'm Jenny Davidson from Council of Single Mothers and Their Children. And I wanted to ask you a question about the Gender Equality Budget Statement. So Victoria is essentially the most progressive state when it comes to government taking a stance on gender equality, and we've just been discussing that. And I will not be alone in the room to be sorry to see that this statement is a whole lot of spin. Now I'm going to give you a really specific example. You say you invest $1.8 billion in women's economic security, and that includes investments like $755 million in expanding hospitals. So while hospitals do have female-dominated workforce, the reality is that they actually are the majority of the low-paid workforce, but there's no money earmarked, as far as this document indicates, in things like closing the gender pay gap in that sector. It also includes lots of discussion about education, because women are students too, but there's no specific funding for challenges that women face, like covering the cost of childcare or devices and Wi-Fi. So what I'd like to ask you, Treasurer, is, seeing as you're committed to these sort of statements, could you, in future gender equality budget statements, genuinely report on investments in gender equity? And then, if it is a bit thin on the ground, you know that you need to invest more.
Okay. Thanks for the question. Well, I almost take it as if it was a compliment that I am capable of spin, because during my media training, most of my media advisors say you're hopeless at the spin stuff. So if that's the impression you've got, can I say, I don't think it reflects the effort. Now, sure, I accept that governments from time to time don't live up to your expectations and will move at the pace that we all would want, but certainly from our perspective, the longest journey starts with the first step in that journey, and we think that we've been on this journey for a while now. One of the things that we said in the gender responsive budgeting legislation and in the process that underpins it, that is when the Budget and Finance Committee makes a decision, we have to have advice in front of us about what the nature of the decision means in terms of gender equality. How does it impact upon women's lives? So we've got a pretty simple scorecard really that goes either it's negative, it's neutral, or it's positive. Now, we've played around with different ways of trying to describe this, but we figure it's probably better at least to know whether or not you're doing harm and how many you can legitimately put into a category that says you're actually substantively assisting the situation. Now, sometimes I'd be prepared to accept in the early iterations of this stuff, we were sort of, trying to rationalise outcomes to suit the policy framework. For example, we had a support for swimming in schools initiative, and the gender responsive budgeting proposal said, well, this is good because less women die drowning as a consequence of the intervention. Well, I would have figured that in a broader sense it would be broadly neutral because it wasn't focused at a gender outcome but as a human outcome more substantively. But I accept that we've got more to do and it's a journey that we're on. Can I just make a couple of points? No money earmarked for the gender pay gap. Well, as we know, I'm the Minister for Industrial Relations as well for my sins in a Labor government. That's a reasonably torrid engagement. We are in a process of negotiation with the nurses at the moment around their pay. Yes, we have made provision for wage outcomes. We've got a wages policy, and we also recognise that the nurses in our healthcare system have been doing it pretty tough over the last little while because the pandemic might have stopped for everybody else, but it hasn't stopped for them. We also know that Fair Work is going to do a pay equity case in this area probably this year. So we'll have to provision for that as well, and we will when the money comes through, and we can expect, given past form by Fair Work, that the Treasurer of the State will be required to find and provision for that pay outcome. So we accept that it's happening. Finally, covering the cost of childcare. Look, you can only do as much as materially you have a capacity for, and I think we could be marked on a lack of commitment or a lack of effort, and I don't think there's either a lack of commitment or effort from government, but there is a material constraint, and that's our budget. So, of course, the decisions that we've made in terms of a free kinder and so forth probably saves families about $2,500 a kid, so it's a pretty substantial one for young families, but you know, it's a big investment. It's a long-term journey that we're on.
I'm Kathy Wilson, the CEO of VIMIAC, the consumer peak in Victoria, so I'm going back to the mental health story. And the first comment from the consumer perspective, and I do have a question that we'd like to make, is that given that you did not fund recommendation 29 and haven't for 3 years, and it is to set up a consumer-led organisation that leads in innovation of programs, in consumer workforce development and in partnership across the system. That hasn't been funded. and continues not to be funded, and it's a central piece of the architecture of the transform system. And it is one consumers had their hearts and hopes set on, and that leaving it late does not help in the transformation process. And in addition, the community model for acute residential services for consumers, led by consumers, also has not been funded. So for us, it's a broken promise and it's a betrayal. It's a small ticket item, or their small ticket items, that won't make it much difference to the repayments on debt. However, they are part of keeping faith with consumers and the Royal Commission and centralising consumer leadership, consumer knowledge in the whole of the reform process through our very own leadership. So my question is, are you saying, when you say it's a workforce supply issue, that you do not, your government does not have faith that there are the consumer leaders who would step up and lead these initiatives right now, and there is not the consumer workforce who would 300% rather work and contribute to change through a consumer-led and owned organisation?
Thanks for the question. Look, I suppose as a government we have to recognise that this is a journey that we've been on in regard to the effort that we've put in, both in terms of broader mental health initiatives, but also the questions around the lived experience agency, which aligns with those recommendations of the Royal Commission, including recommendation 29. I mean, we have made a fair effort in this space already. As I say, 90% of those recommendations are underway, and we've invested $6 billion. I have already indicated, of course, that we will continue that investment. We've put in something like $10.36 million per year for lived and living experience workforce development. And our expectation is, yes, we're going to be a little bit slower than initially proposed in terms of implementing all of the Royal Commission's proposals. I'm, however, not walking away from the government's very clear commitment that we will implement all of those recommendations. They take time, they take effort, and we accept that there is plenty of experience and capacity in people in the area that could assist us in being able to deliver these services, but being able to roll them out in a way that achieves the objectives and enables us not to go too fast and therefore get to a position where, we do a disservice to all the other areas of effort that require investment in the social and caring services is critically important. But I can only leave you with this point that the government will remain committed to implementing all of the 74 recommendations of the Royal Commission. So yes, we've been a little slower than we would have liked to have got on the Lived Experience Agency, but that work will continue and we will get to a point of conclusion.
Just over this side of the room to Deb.
Good afternoon, Treasurer. Thanks so much for being here. My name's Abigail and I'm here representing VACRO, which is an organisation that supports people leaving the prison system to create new beginnings for themselves and their families. While it's wonderful to see a budget focused on helping families, it's unfortunate that the families of people who are incarcerated were not fully included in this effort. The evidence shows that strong family connection reduces reoffending and intergenerational involvement in the justice system. And the inquiry into children affected by parental incarceration made a number of recommendations for relatively low-cost, evidence-based interventions to help these families. But over the two budgets since the inquiry, just as one example, we've seen both of the specialist therapeutic family counselling services in Victorian prisons defunded instead. Treasurer, it's estimated that 7,000 Victorian children have a parent in prison at any time, and investing in these families would appear to epitomise the ethos of early intervention. Can we expect to see such investment in the future?
Thanks, Abigail. I suppose the short answer would be yes. I mean, it essentially gets down to capacity, and the other area where I'd encourage you to have some discussions with the team in the Department of Treasury and Finance, the early intervention team, get them to give you some advice about how you structure a proposal for government. And I'm not putting the responsibility back on you, but look, the best way to advocate, I would say, is show that it meets the interests of Treasury and it achieves the full realisation of that early intervention investment framework. I often use avoidance of the justice system for young people as a classic illustration about how early intervention really does pay substantial dividends. I don't imagine it would be particularly difficult for you to be able to make your case. And what I'll do is make sure that one of my staff gives you their card so you can contact us and tell us how the journey's gone. We can probably organise the intro into the department as well.
Happy with that? All right. Round of applause for the Treasurer for answering our questions today.
Thanks very much, Lou.
Well, that brings us to the end of our question time with the Premier. Thank you, everyone who stood up and asked a question of the Treasurer today. Did I just say Premier? There you go. There's a promotion. I don't know if you do or you don't want it, but there you go. Thank you, Treasurer. Now I'll hand over to VCOS CEO Juanita Pope, who I earlier called Juanita Hope, and I think that is a Freudian slip on my behalf. So thank you, Juanita.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Treasurer. You might have seen on the little pamphlets that you've got in front of you that the Treasurer's Q&A was to finish, a good 10 plus minutes ago, and we really appreciate, Treasurer, that you've been generous with your time and taking extra questions from a very engaged room here today. I also, just backing up a little bit today, want to thank Perry for his beautiful welcome to country and to pay respects to Wurundjeri Wurrung elders and ancestors, and also to extend that respect and acknowledgement to First Nations people with us here today. Treasurer, this is your 10th Victorian budget and your 6th VCOS Treasurer's event. And this function really has come to mean a lot to us at VCOS and a lot to our members and the broader sector, and I hope too that it's a meaningful event in your annual calendar in this incredibly busy budget week. As a sector and from a VCOS perspective, we are all about good social policy, good outcomes for the people who need it most, and that means that at times we will call it out if we feel like budgets miss the mark or if decisions are made which disappoint. But we also, and I think you've heard that in the room today as well, we will also give praise where it's due for investments that are important to our sector and to the communities that we represent and serve. So thank you again. I commend you as well every year for engaging with our sector, not just at this event, but generally, and I know that even in your remarks today, you've suggested that people can come and see you and meet with you, and I think it's a very genuine and generous offer. You answer our questions, you engage with our sector, you explain the decisions that government has made. So we genuinely thank you for that engagement and the respect that you show the sector by being here every year. Thank you. And as many of you in the room will know, it's also a bit of a tradition that VCOS offers a bit of a fun present to the Treasurer at this event each year. I believe one year it was a tree, another year it was a little fuzzy bear soft toy called Wellbeing. And Treasurer, this year, our Director of Communications, Ryan Shields, who trawls the media a lot, found a beautiful little snippet from you using some relatively blunt language earlier this year to describe the New South Wales Premier, and I believe we've got that vision.
The mathematically challenged New South Wales Premier, he might not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but he is a tool.
Now, Treasurer, we here at VCOS would like to defend tools. Tools build things, they shape things, they tend to things, and they create things. So we know that you are a keen gardener, so we would like you to accept this incredibly auspicious and ceremonial VCOS garden tool. Tools can be useful, Treasurer, and every treasurer needs to dig deep from time to time, especially in the name of social justice, equity and inclusion and wellbeing.